Settle into bed and get comfortable wherever you are in the world tonight. Perhaps you're watching from a bustling city where the lights never quite dim, or maybe from a quiet countryside where stars pepper the darkness above. Whatever time it is there, and whatever brought you to this moment of rest, you're about to embark on a journey through time to one of history's most mysterious and forgotten wonders. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Egypt, to a time when the world was young and full of mysteries that still captivate us today. We're going to explore the story of the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt, a structure so magnificent that the ancient Greek historian Herodotus declared it more impressive than the pyramids themselves. Yet today, this wonder has vanished almost entirely from both the landscape and our collective memory. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let your mind drift back over 2.5 millennia to a world where the impossible seemed routine and where human ambition carved monuments that would challenge the very gods. The year was approximately 450 BCE, when a curious Greek man named Herodotus found himself standing in the scorching Egyptian sun, notebook in hand, preparing to witness something that would leave him speechless. Herodotus, who would later be known as the father of history, was a traveler by nature and a collector of stories by trade. He had journeyed from his homeland in modern-day Turkey, through the islands of the Aegean, across the Mediterranean, and into the heart of the ancient world's most mysterious civilization. Egypt in Herodotus' time was already ancient beyond imagination. The Great Pyramid of Giza, which we still marvel at today, was already over 2,000 years old when Herodotus first laid eyes upon it. But it wasn't the pyramids that would capture his imagination most profoundly during his Egyptian sojourn. No, it was something far more complex, far more intricate, and far more mysterious. As Herodotus stood in the region south of modern-day Cairo, in an area the ancients called the Fayyum, he gazed upon a structure that defied every expectation he had formed about human architecture. Before him stretched what appeared to be not just a building, but an entire city folded in upon itself, a maze of stone and shadow that seemed to breathe with its own mysterious life. I found it greater than words can tell. Herodotus would later write, his normally precise prose becoming almost poetic in the face of what he witnessed. The structure he described wasn't just large, it was incomprehensibly vast. According to his careful measurements and observations, the labyrinth covered an area that would encompass multiple city blocks in a modern metropolis. But size alone wasn't what impressed the Greek historian. It was the complexity, the mind-bending intricacy of the design that left him struggling for adequate words. Herodotus described a building that contained 3,000 chambers, 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below. The above-ground chambers he was permitted to explore, wandering through corridors that twisted and turned, opened into vast halls, narrowed into intimate passages, and occasionally opened up to courtyards where the Egyptian sun painted geometric patterns on ancient stone floors. The underground chambers, however, remained forbidden to him. The Egyptian priests who served as his guides were adamant about this restriction. These lower levels, they explained, contained the tombs of the kings who had built the labyrinth, as well as the sacred tombs of the holy crocodiles. To disturb these sacred spaces would invite the wrath of gods whose anger could shake the very foundations of the world. Herodotus, ever the careful historian, respected these boundaries, but his curiosity burned like a flame. What lay beneath his feet? What secrets were hidden in those 1,500 chambers that existed in perpetual darkness? The questions would haunt him, and through his writings, they would haunt humanity for millennia to come. To understand the true magnificence of the Lost Labyrinth, we must journey even further back in time, to an era when Egypt was not the ancient civilization that Herodotus encountered, but a vibrant, expanding empire under the rule of powerful pharaohs who commanded resources and manpower that boggled the mind. The story begins with Pharaoh Amenemhat III, who ruled during Egypt's 12th dynasty, approximately 1860 to 1814 BCE. This was during what historians call the Middle Kingdom, a golden age of Egyptian civilization when art, literature, and architecture reached heights that would influence human culture for thousands of years to come. Amenemhat III was not content to simply rule Egypt. He wanted to transform it. His reign was marked by massive public works projects that reshaped the landscape of the Nile Valley. He oversaw the construction of irrigation systems that turned desert into fertile farmland, built fortresses that protected Egypt's borders, and commissioned temples that glorified the gods who blessed his reign. But Amenemhat III's greatest vision was something unprecedented in human history. He wanted to create a structure that would serve multiple purposes: an administrative center for his vast kingdom, a religious complex that would honor all the gods of Egypt, and ultimately, an eternal resting place for himself and the sacred animals that were central to Egyptian religious practice. The location he chose was perfect for such an ambitious project. The Fayum region, where the labyrinth would rise, was already special to the Egyptians. This area, southwest of Memphis, was where the Nile River created a natural oasis, a fertile depression that was like a green jewel set in the golden desert. The region was associated with Sobuk, the crocodile god, and was home to Lake Moeris, a vast body of water that served as both a natural reservoir and a sacred site. Here, on the shores of this holy lake, Amenemhat III's architects and engineers would attempt something that had never been tried before. They would create a building so complex, so intricate, that it would challenge every convention of architecture and push the limits of human engineering skills. The planning alone must have taken years. Imagine the scrolls of papyrus covered with architectural drawings, the wooden models constructed to test design concepts, the endless meetings between the pharaoh, his architects, his priests, and his engineers. They were designing more than just a building. They were creating a three-dimensional representation of the Egyptian cosmos itself. The labyrinth was to be a microcosm of Egypt, containing chambers dedicated to each of the country's 42 nomes or administrative districts. But it was also to be a religious complex, with spaces for the worship of Egypt's countless deities. And beneath it all, in those mysterious underground chambers, would be the eternal resting places of kings and sacred animals. Construction began sometime around 1850 BCE, and it would continue for decades. Thousands of workers, skilled craftsmen, architects, engineers, stonemasons, artists, and laborers dedicated their lives to realizing Amenemhat III's impossible vision. Limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, were quarried from nearby sites and transported to the construction site. Cedar wood was imported from Lebanon for roofing beams. Gold leaf was applied to surfaces that would catch and reflect the light of oil lamps and torches. As the structure grew, rising from the desert floor like some fantastic dream made manifest in stone, it began to attract attention from across the ancient world. Travelers and diplomats arriving in Egypt would hear whispered stories about the impossible building taking shape in the Fayum. Some came just to witness the construction, standing at a respectful distance and marveling at the organized chaos of thousands of workers transforming raw stone into architectural poetry. To truly understand what Herodotus witnessed, we must try to imagine ourselves walking through the labyrinth as he did, our sandaled feet echoing on polished stone floors, our eyes struggling to adjust to the play of light and shadow that characterized every corridor and chamber. The entrance to the labyrinth was itself a marvel. Herodotus described massive doors, each weighing tons, that opened into a reception hall so vast that its ceiling disappeared into shadows above. The walls were covered with hieroglyphs and painted scenes depicting the achievements of Amenemhat III and the blessings of the gods. Gold leaf caught the light of torches, making the very walls seem to glow with divine radiance. From this entrance hall, corridors branched out in every direction. Some led to chambers dedicated to specific administrative functions, vast rooms where scribes worked at calculating taxes, managing grain distributions, and recording the countless details of governing an empire. Others opened into religious spaces, sanctuaries dedicated to particular deities where priests performed daily rituals that maintained the cosmic order. But what made the labyrinth truly labyrinthine was the way these spaces connected to each other. Unlike a typical building, where rooms are arranged in a logical, predictable pattern, the labyrinth seemed to follow a logic all its own. A corridor might start by heading north, then curve west, then turn south, then spiral back on itself before opening into a chamber that connected to 3 other passages. Herodotus described getting lost repeatedly during his exploration. Even with Egyptian guides who knew the building intimately, he found himself disoriented, unable to predict where a particular passage might lead. The architects had created a structure that challenged the very way the human mind processes spatial relationships. Some chambers were intimate spaces, suitable for private meetings or personal meditation. Others were vast halls capable of holding hundreds of people. Still others were strange, narrow corridors that seemed to serve no obvious purpose except to confuse and disorient visitors. There were chambers with soaring ceilings supported by massive columns, and others where the ceiling pressed down so low that visitors had to duck to pass through. The play of light throughout the labyrinth was particularly striking. The architects had designed the structure with numerous courtyards and light wells that brought natural sunlight deep into the interior spaces. But the complex geometry of the building meant that this light was constantly changing, creating a shifting pattern of illumination that changed throughout the day. A chamber that was brightly lit in the morning might be filled with mysterious shadows by afternoon, completely transforming its character and mood. Water was another element that the architects incorporated in unexpected ways. There were fountains in some chambers, their gentle splashing adding a musical quality to the ambient sound of the labyrinth. Other rooms featured pools that reflected light from oil lamps, creating dancing patterns on the walls and ceilings. The sound of flowing water could be heard throughout much of the structure, though visitors often couldn't determine where exactly the sound was coming from. The Egyptian guides who accompanied Herodotus through the upper level spoke of the labyrinth as a living entity, something that breathed and changed with the seasons and the hours of the day. They described how the building felt different in the heat of summer than in the cooler months, how certain chambers were used for different purposes depending on the time of year, and how the complex acoustics of the space meant that sounds could travel in unexpected ways through the interconnected rooms. While Herodotus was permitted to explore the 1,500 chambers above ground, the 1,500 underground chambers remained tantalizingly out of reach. The Egyptian priests who served as his guides were absolutely adamant about this restriction, and their reverence and fear when discussing the underground levels made it clear that these were not merely administrative spaces, but sacred areas where the very deepest mysteries of Egyptian religion were housed. What lay beneath the labyrinth that inspired such awe and terror in the priests who guarded its secrets? According to the limited information that Herodotus was able to gather, the underground chambers served as tombs for the pharaohs who had built the labyrinth, as well as burial chambers for the sacred crocodiles of Sobuk. The choice to bury sacred crocodiles beneath the labyrinth was not arbitrary. In Egyptian religion, crocodiles were associated with Sobuk, one of the most ancient and powerful of the Egyptian deities. Sobuk was a god of the Nile, of fertility, of protection, and of the pharaoh's power. He was often depicted as a crocodile or as a man with a crocodile head, and he was both feared and revered throughout Egypt. The Fayum region where the labyrinth was built was particularly associated with Sobuk worship. The nearby Lake Moeris was home to large populations of Nile crocodiles, and the Egyptians believed that these creatures were physical manifestations of the god himself. When these sacred crocodiles died, they were mummified with the same care and reverence accorded to human royalty, then buried in elaborate tombs. But the underground chambers of the labyrinth contained more than just crocodile mummies. According to the priests, the pharaohs themselves were buried there, along with vast treasures intended to sustain them in the afterlife. These royal burial chambers were designed not just as repositories for the dead, but as eternal palaces where the departed pharaohs could continue their cosmic duties. The priests described underground chambers filled with golden objects, precious stones, furniture made from rare woods, and artifacts whose power was so great that merely looking upon them could blind or kill an unprepared mortal. They spoke of chambers where the air itself was dangerous, filled with incense and magical vapors that could transport a person's soul to other realms of existence. Perhaps most intriguingly, the priests hinted that the underground chambers contained knowledge that was too dangerous for ordinary humans to possess. They spoke of libraries carved into the stone walls, filled with hieroglyphic texts that revealed the true names of the gods, the secret history of creation, and magical formulas that could control the forces of nature itself. The priests also described the underground chambers as being interconnected by a network of passages that was even more complex than the above-ground labyrinth. They suggested that there were chambers so deep beneath the ground that they connected to underground rivers and caverns that extended far beyond the boundaries of the labyrinth itself. Some chambers, they claimed, were so far underground that they were closer to the underworld of the dead than to the world of the living. The acoustic properties of these underground spaces were said to be particularly mysterious. The priests described chambers where whispers could be heard from miles away, and others where the loudest shouts were absorbed completely by the stone, creating an eerie silence that felt almost supernatural. They spoke of chambers where the sound of distant drums could be heard, though no drums were being played, and others where visitors could hear the voices of the dead pharaohs, still conducting the business of ruling Egypt from beyond the grave. The more we examine the descriptions of the Lost Labyrinth, the more it becomes clear that this was not simply a large building, but a structure designed according to principles that we can barely comprehend today. The architects who created the labyrinth were working with concepts of sacred geometry, astronomical alignments, and symbolic representation that went far beyond mere aesthetic considerations. The number 3,000, the total number of chambers in the labyrinth, was not chosen randomly. In Egyptian numerology, this number had deep spiritual significance, representing the perfect balance between the earthly realm, the heavenly realm, and the underworld. The division of these chambers into 1,500 above ground and 1,500 below ground created a perfect symmetry that reflected the Egyptian understanding of cosmic order. The layout of the labyrinth also reflected Egyptian religious and political geography. Each of Egypt's 42 nomes was represented by a series of chambers dedicated to the specific deities, administrative functions, and cultural characteristics of that region. Walking through the labyrinth was, in a very real sense, like traveling through all of Egypt in miniature. But the architects went even further in embedding symbolic meaning into the structure. The pathways through the labyrinth were designed to mirror the journey of the soul through the afterlife, as described in Egyptian religious texts like the Book of the Dead. Visitors moving through the complex were unknowingly reenacting the cosmic journey that every soul must make after death, encountering challenges, revelations, and transformations that mirrored the spiritual trials described in Egyptian mythology. The astronomical alignments of the labyrinth were equally sophisticated. The structure was oriented to capture specific celestial events: the rising of Sirius, the heliacal rising of various constellations, the solstices and equinoxes. At certain times of the year, sunlight would penetrate deep into the interior of the labyrinth, illuminating specific chambers and creating dramatic visual effects that reinforce the building's spiritual significance. The architects also incorporated acoustic principles that we're only beginning to understand today. The complex geometry of the interconnected chambers created resonance effects that could amplify certain sounds while dampening others. Priests conducting rituals in one part of the labyrinth could create sound effects that would be heard in distant chambers, giving the impression that the voices of gods were speaking from within the very stones of the building. Water flow throughout the structure was carefully engineered not just for practical purposes, but for symbolic ones as well. The movement of water through channels and pools within the labyrinth was designed to mirror the flow of the Nile River, the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. The sound of flowing water created a constant, subtle background that reminded visitors of the eternal cycle of death and renewal that the Nile represented. The use of different types of stone throughout the labyrinth also followed symbolic principles. Harder stones like granite were used in areas associated with permanence and divine power, while softer limestone was used in spaces designed for human activities. The color variations in the stone were carefully chosen to create visual effects that reinforced the spiritual significance of different areas within the complex. Even the maze-like quality of the labyrinth's layout served symbolic purposes. Getting lost within the structure was not seen as a design flaw, but as an intentional spiritual challenge. The confusion and disorientation that visitors experienced was meant to mirror the confusion of the soul when first entering the afterlife. Only by persevering, by continuing to search for the correct path despite setbacks and wrong turns, could a person achieve spiritual enlightenment and find their way to the most sacred chambers. The priests who served at the labyrinth were not ordinary religious functionaries, but members of an ancient and exclusive brotherhood that had been initiated into mysteries that dated back to the very founding of Egyptian civilization. These priests, who served as Herodotus' guides during his visit, represented an unbroken chain of knowledge and tradition that stretched back over 1,000 years. To become a priest of the labyrinth required not just religious dedication, but years of intensive study in mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and the complex symbolic systems that governed Egyptian religious thought. These priests had to memorize the layout of all 3,000 chambers, understand the significance of each space, and be able to navigate the complex without ever becoming lost. But their knowledge went far beyond mere spatial memory. The priests understood the acoustic properties of every chamber, knew which rooms would resonate with human voices, and which would absorb sound completely. They knew the precise times when sunlight would illuminate specific chambers, and they could predict how the movement of water through the structure would change with the seasons. Most importantly, these priests were the guardians of the underground chambers, the keepers of secrets so profound that revealing them to unauthorized individuals was considered not just sacrilege, but a crime that could destabilize the cosmic order itself. They alone knew what lay beneath the labyrinth, and they alone had the authority to determine who, if anyone, might be permitted to enter those forbidden depths. The training of these priests began in childhood. Young boys from specific families that had served the labyrinth for generations were brought to the complex and began their education in its mysteries. They started by learning to navigate the simplest pathways, gradually working their way up to more complex routes as they proved their ability and dedication. As their training progressed, these young initiates learned not just the physical layout of the labyrinth, but its spiritual significance as well. They studied the religious texts that explained the symbolic meaning of each chamber, the astronomical observations that had guided the structure's design, and the magical practices that were performed in its various spaces. The most advanced priests, those who had completed decades of study and proven their absolute reliability, were eventually initiated into the mysteries of the underground chambers. This initiation was itself a profound spiritual experience, involving ritual purification, fasting, and the consumption of sacred substances that altered consciousness and prepared the initiate for contact with divine forces. These fully initiated priests spoke of the underground chambers as being alive, filled with spiritual energies that could overwhelm anyone who entered without proper preparation. They described chambers where the very air glowed with supernatural light, and others where the temperature remained constant regardless of the season above ground. They spoke of chambers where time seemed to move differently, where an hour could feel like a minute or a day, and where visitors sometimes lost all sense of their normal human identity. The priests also served as interpreters of the oracle that the labyrinth contained. In certain chambers, under specific conditions, the structure itself would provide answers to important questions about the future of Egypt, the will of the gods, and the cosmic forces that shaped human destiny. These oracular pronouncements were taken very seriously by Egypt's rulers, and major political and military decisions were often influenced by messages received within the labyrinth's sacred chambers. For over a millennium, the labyrinth served as one of the most important religious and administrative centers in Egypt. During its golden age, which lasted from its construction under Amenemhat III through the height of the New Kingdom, the complex was a bustling center of activity that drew visitors from across the ancient world. On any given day, the labyrinth might host diplomatic meetings between Egyptian officials and foreign ambassadors, religious ceremonies honoring the gods of Egypt's various regions, administrative sessions where taxes were calculated and government policies were debated, and private consultations where individuals sought guidance from the priests who interpreted the structure's oracular powers. The above-ground chambers hummed with constant activity. Scribes worked at calculating the complex logistics of governing an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Levant. Priests performed elaborate rituals in chambers filled with incense and flickering oil lamps. Architects and engineers studied the structure itself, trying to understand the principles that had guided its construction so that they might apply similar techniques to other building projects. The courtyards of the labyrinth were filled with merchants selling goods from across the known world, artists creating works inspired by the structure's magnificent architecture, and scholars from various civilizations who came to study Egyptian wisdom and knowledge. The complex had its own kitchens, workshops, libraries, and living quarters for the hundreds of people who worked there on a permanent basis. During major religious festivals, the labyrinth would host elaborate ceremonies that drew thousands of participants. These festivals were spectacular affairs, with processions that wound through the complex's corridors, musical performances that took advantage of the structure's unique acoustic properties, and ritual dramas that reenacted the mythological stories central to Egyptian religion. The most important of these festivals was the annual celebration of Sobuk, the crocodile god, which took place when the Nile reached its highest flood levels. During this festival, live crocodiles from Lake Moeris were brought into specific chambers of the labyrinth, where they were treated as living manifestations of the god himself. Visitors could approach these sacred animals and make offerings, seeking blessings for fertility, protection, and prosperity. The wealth that flowed through the labyrinth during these centuries was extraordinary. Tribute from Egypt's vassal states, taxes from the country's productive agricultural regions, and gifts from foreign rulers seeking Egypt's favor all found their way to the complex. The underground chambers were said to contain treasures that rivaled those of the pharaoh's tombs in the Valley of the Kings. But the labyrinth was more than just a repository for wealth. It was a center for the creation of culture and knowledge. The scholars who worked there produced some of the most important texts in Egyptian literature, including religious works that influenced Egyptian spiritual thought for centuries, historical chronicles that preserved the memory of ancient events, and scientific treatises that advanced human understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The artists who worked at the labyrinth created decorative elements for the structure itself, but they also produced portable works of art that were traded throughout the ancient world. Jewelry, sculptures, paintings, and decorative objects created by labyrinth artists found their way to palaces and temples from Mesopotamia to the Greek islands, spreading Egyptian artistic influence across the civilized world. Like all human achievements, the labyrinth could not maintain its glory forever. The forces that would eventually lead to its abandonment and destruction began to gather strength even during the height of its power, though centuries would pass before their full impact became apparent. The first challenges came from changes within Egypt itself. As the power of the pharaohs began to decline during the later periods of Egyptian history, the resources needed to maintain a complex as vast and sophisticated as the labyrinth became increasingly difficult to obtain. The hundreds of priests, administrators, craftsmen, and laborers who kept the complex functioning required enormous amounts of food, materials, and payment that strained even Egypt's legendary wealth. Political changes also affected the labyrinth's status. As Egypt's capital moved from Memphis to other cities, and as the administrative functions of government were reorganized, many of the bureaucratic activities that had been centered at the labyrinth were relocated to other sites. The complex gradually lost its role as a center of government, though it remained important as a religious site. The conquest of Egypt by foreign powers dealt severe blows to the labyrinth's fortunes. When the Assyrians, then the Persians, and finally the Greeks under Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, they brought with them different religious traditions and administrative practices. The new rulers had little interest in maintaining an enormous complex dedicated to Egyptian gods and Egyptian political traditions. Under the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt after Alexander's conquest, the labyrinth continued to function, but with greatly reduced resources and influence. Many of its chambers were closed, the number of priests was dramatically reduced, and the elaborate festivals that had once drawn thousands of participants became smaller, more subdued affairs. The rise of Christianity in the later Roman period dealt another blow to the labyrinth. The new religion was actively hostile to the ancient Egyptian deities that the complex had been built to honor. Christian authorities viewed the labyrinth as a center of pagan superstition and actively discouraged people from visiting or supporting it. By the 4th century CE, the labyrinth was largely abandoned. The last priests, keepers of knowledge and traditions that stretched back over a millennium, either died without passing on their secrets or converted to Christianity and deliberately allowed the old wisdom to be forgotten. The underground chambers, sealed and forbidden for so long, remained sealed, but now because no one remembered how to open them rather than because they were too sacred to enter. Without constant maintenance, the structure began to deteriorate. The complex water systems that had kept fountains flowing and pools filled fell into disrepair. Roof beams rotted and collapsed, allowing rain and wind-blown sand to enter chambers that had been carefully protected for centuries. Stone blocks, no longer maintained and protected, began to crack and crumble. Local populations, faced with the ruins of a structure they no longer understood, began using it as a source of building materials. Stone blocks that had been carefully carved and fitted by ancient craftsmen were broken apart and hauled away to build houses, walls, and other utilitarian structures. Precious metals and decorative elements were stripped away and sold or melted down. What happened to the Labyrinth of Egypt represents one of history's most tragic examples of how human knowledge and achievement can simply vanish, leaving barely a trace behind. The process by which this magnificent structure disappeared from both the landscape and human memory is a complex story of cultural change, religious transformation, and the simple passage of time. When Herodotus visited the labyrinth in the 5th century BCE, it was already over 1,000 years old, but it was still functioning and still impressive enough to leave him speechless with wonder. Yet by the time Arab writers began describing Egypt in the early medieval period, the labyrinth had become a legend, a story told about something that might or might not have actually existed. The Arab historian al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century CE, mentioned hearing stories about an enormous ancient structure in the Fayyum region, but his description was based on second-hand accounts and local folklore rather than direct observation. By his time, the labyrinth had already been reduced to scattered ruins that bore little resemblance to the magnificent complex that Herodotus had explored. Medieval European travelers to Egypt, following in the footsteps of Herodotus, searched for the labyrinth but found only confusing archaeological remains that didn't seem to match the ancient descriptions. Some began to doubt whether the structure had ever existed at all, suggesting that Herodotus had been deceived by his Egyptian guides or had exaggerated what he had actually seen. This skepticism was reinforced by the rise of more critical approaches to historical study during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Scholars who were eager to separate fact from fiction in ancient texts began to view Herodotus' description of the labyrinth as one of the many tall tales that the father of history had supposedly included in his work. The irony is that while scholars were debating whether the labyrinth had ever existed, local Egyptian farmers were literally walking over its remains every day. The site where the great complex had stood was gradually buried under centuries of Nile silt and wind-blown sand. What had once been chambers and corridors became fertile agricultural land where crops grew in soil enriched by the decomposed organic materials that had once filled the ancient rooms. The final blow to the labyrinth's physical remains came during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when Egypt was undergoing rapid modernization. The construction of new irrigation systems, roads, and agricultural improvements in the Fayyum region disturbed what remained of the ancient foundations. Stone blocks that had survived for over 3 millennia were finally broken up and used as fill material for modern construction projects. By the mid-20th century, virtually nothing remained of the structure that Herodotus had declared more impressive than the pyramids themselves. The location of the labyrinth had become a matter of scholarly debate, with different archaeologists proposing different sites based on limited and often contradictory evidence. This forgetting was not just physical but cultural as well. The religious traditions that had given the labyrinth its meaning were completely lost. The priests who had once navigated its corridors with perfect confidence were long dead, and the initiatory traditions that had preserved their knowledge had been broken. The symbolic language that had informed the structure's design was as dead as the civilization that had created it. Even the name labyrinth became problematic. The word itself comes from ancient Greek, not Egyptian, and it's possible that the Egyptians had an entirely different name for their great complex, a name that has been lost along with so much else from their civilization. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed a remarkable renaissance of interest in the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt, driven by advances in archaeological techniques, satellite imaging, and ground-penetrating radar that have made it possible to search for ancient structures that leave no visible traces on the surface. The modern search for the labyrinth began in earnest in the early 1900s, when archaeologists like Flinders Petrie began systematic excavations in the Fayyum region. Petrie, one of the founding figures of scientific archaeology, was convinced that Herodotus had been describing a real structure and that its remains could be found if researchers looked in the right places using the right techniques. Petrie's excavations revealed tantalizing clues, scattered stone blocks that seemed to match the limestone described by Herodotus, pottery fragments that dated to the correct historical period, and most intriguingly, the remains of what appeared to be a massive foundation system that extended far underground. However, the full extent of these remains was impossible to determine using the archaeological techniques available at the time. The work was continued by other archaeologists throughout the 20th century, each generation bringing new technologies and methodologies to bear on the mystery. Aerial photography revealed unusual patterns in agricultural fields that might represent the outlines of ancient walls buried beneath centuries of sediment. Ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies in the subsurface that could represent void spaces, possibly the remains of the chambers that Herodotus had described. In recent decades, satellite imaging has revolutionized the search for lost ancient sites. High-resolution images taken from space can detect subtle variations in soil color and vegetation patterns that often mark the locations of buried archaeological remains. When these techniques were applied to the Fayum region, researchers found several areas where the satellite data suggested the presence of large, complex buried structures. One of the most promising discoveries came in 2008, when a team of Belgian archaeologists working with ground-penetrating radar claimed to have located what they believed to be the remains of the Lost Labyrinth. Their radar scans revealed an enormous complex of underground chambers and corridors that seemed to match Herodotus' description in terms of both size and complexity. According to their analysis, the structure they had detected covered an area of approximately 6 hectares and contained numerous void spaces that could represent the rooms and passages of the ancient labyrinth. Most intriguingly, their scans suggested that much of the underground portion of the structure remained intact, protected by the layers of sediment that had accumulated over the centuries. However, the political and economic challenges of conducting large-scale excavations in Egypt have prevented researchers from confirming these discoveries through actual digging. The area where the labyrinth is believed to be located is now covered by modern settlements and agricultural areas, making archaeological investigation extremely difficult and expensive. The mystery has been further complicated by the discovery of other large ancient structures in the region that might be confused with the labyrinth. Excavations have revealed the remains of several significant temples, administrative complexes, and residential areas that date to various periods of ancient Egyptian history. Determining which, if any, of these represents the specific structure that Herodotus visited requires careful analysis of the archaeological evidence combined with close reading of the ancient texts. Modern Egyptologists have also begun to re-examine the ancient sources themselves, using improved understanding of ancient Greek and Egyptian languages to create more accurate translations of key texts. This work has revealed details in Herodotus' account that previous scholars had overlooked or misinterpreted, providing new clues about the labyrinth's location, design, and purpose, while archaeologists and historians have been searching for the physical remains of the Lost Labyrinth. The structure has also taken on a life of its own in human imagination and culture. The very concept of a labyrinth, a complex, maze-like structure designed to confuse and challenge those who enter it, has become a powerful metaphor that appears in literature, art, psychology, and popular culture around the world. The influence of Herodotus' description can be traced through centuries of European literature and art. Medieval writers incorporated the idea of the Egyptian labyrinth into their stories, often combining it with other mythological labyrinths, like the one that housed the Minotaur in ancient Crete. These literary labyrinths became symbols of the complexity of human existence, the difficulty of finding truth in a confusing world, and the spiritual journey that every person must undertake. During the Renaissance, when interest in ancient Egypt was revived throughout Europe, artists and architects began creating works inspired by descriptions of the Lost Labyrinth. Garden mazes became popular among European nobility, partly inspired by the idea of recreating the wonder that Herodotus had described. These garden labyrinths, while much smaller and simpler than their ancient inspiration, captured something of the same sense of mystery and discovery. The Romantic poets of the 18th and 19th centuries were particularly drawn to the labyrinth as a symbol of the sublime, that mixture of beauty and terror that they saw as the highest form of aesthetic experience. Writers like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Lord Byron referenced the Lost Labyrinth in their work, using it as a metaphor for the human psyche and the mysterious depths of consciousness that were just beginning to be explored by early psychologists. In the 20th century, the labyrinth took on new significance as psychologists like Carl Jung began to use the maze as a symbol for the process of individuation, the psychological journey through which a person discovers their true self. Jung saw labyrinths as representing the unconscious mind, with its complex pathways, hidden chambers, and potential for both enlightenment and danger. Modern literature has continued to draw inspiration from the Lost Labyrinth. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges created stories about infinite libraries and impossible architectures that echo Herodotus' descriptions of chambers beyond counting and passages that seem to follow their own mysterious logic. Umberto Eco's novel, The Name of the Rose, features a labyrinthine library that deliberately evokes the complexity and mystery of the ancient Egyptian structure. Contemporary artists have created installations and sculptures inspired by the idea of the Lost Labyrinth, using modern materials and techniques to explore the themes of confusion, discovery, and transformation that the ancient structure represented. These modern labyrinths serve as spaces for meditation and contemplation, continuing the spiritual function that the original complex may have served. The concept has also found its way into popular culture through films, video games, and television shows that feature maze-like structures filled with secrets and dangers. While these modern interpretations often emphasize the threatening aspects of labyrinths, they continue to tap into the same fundamental human fascination with complex, mysterious spaces that made Herodotus' description so compelling. As we delve deeper into the mystery of the Lost Labyrinth, we begin to understand that its significance extends far beyond its role as an administrative center or religious complex. The structure represents something much more profound, a physical embodiment of the ancient Egyptian understanding of mathematics, geometry, and the fundamental patterns that govern the universe. The Egyptians were master mathematicians, and their understanding of geometric principles was far more sophisticated than many people realize. The precision with which they built the pyramids, the accuracy of their astronomical observations, and the complexity of their engineering projects all demonstrate a mathematical sophistication that rivals our own in many respects. The labyrinth represented the culmination of this mathematical knowledge. The structure's 3,000 chambers were not arranged randomly, but according to geometric principles that created patterns within patterns, symmetries within asymmetries, and harmonies that could be appreciated on multiple levels simultaneously. Modern mathematicians who have studied the descriptions of the labyrinth have identified several geometric principles that seem to have guided its design. The structure appears to have incorporated fractal geometry, patterns that repeat at different scales thousands of years before Western mathematics formally described such concepts. Chambers and corridors were arranged in recursive patterns, where the layout of a small section would be repeated at larger scales throughout the complex. The acoustic properties that Herodotus described also suggest sophisticated mathematical planning. The architects who designed the labyrinth understood principles of sound propagation and resonance that allowed them to create spaces where whispers could be heard across great distances, where multiple conversations could take place in the same room without interfering with each other, and where the sound of footsteps could be used to navigate through areas where visual landmarks were scarce. The integration of water systems throughout the structure demonstrates understanding of fluid dynamics and hydraulic engineering. The Egyptians created a network of channels, pools, and fountains that not only served practical purposes, but also created specific sound environments and visual effects that enhanced the spiritual and aesthetic impact of different areas within the complex. The astronomical alignments incorporated into the labyrinth's design required precise mathematical calculations that took into account the movement of celestial bodies over long periods of time. The architects had to predict how the positions of stars, planets, and the sun would change over decades and centuries, then design the structure so that specific chambers would be illuminated at particular times of year for generations to come. Perhaps most impressively, the labyrinth seems to have been designed as a three-dimensional mathematical model of Egyptian cosmology. The structure represented the Egyptians' understanding of how the universe was organized, with different levels representing different realms of existence, and pathways representing the connections between these realms. This mathematical sophistication helps explain why the labyrinth made such a powerful impression on Herodotus and other ancient visitors. They were experiencing not just a large building, but a physical manifestation of humanity's highest intellectual achievements, a structure that demonstrated mastery of mathematical principles that most people couldn't even comprehend, let alone apply on such a massive scale. If we could somehow travel back in time and walk through the Lost Labyrinth as Herodotus did, what would we experience beyond the visual magnificence that left him struggling for words? What would it feel like to move through those corridors, to hear the sounds echoing from chamber to chamber, to smell the incense and feel the cool air flowing through the complex ventilation systems? The first thing that would strike a modern visitor would be the quality of the silence. In our world, we're constantly surrounded by the sounds of machinery, traffic, electronic devices, and the general background noise of industrial civilization. But in the ancient labyrinth, silence would have had a different quality, not the empty silence of a dead space, but the pregnant silence of a place where every sound had meaning and purpose. Footsteps would echo differently in different chambers, providing audio clues about the size and shape of spaces, even when visual cues were limited. The architects designed the structure so that the sound of someone walking could be heard from great distances in some areas, while in others, even loud voices would be muffled and absorbed by the stone walls. This acoustic landscape would have been as complex and carefully planned as the visual layout of the complex. The smell of the labyrinth would have been equally distinctive. Incense burning in religious chambers would create layers of fragrance that would drift through the corridors, mixing with the natural scent of stone, the metallic smell of bronze fixtures, and the organic odors of the oils used in lamps and torches. Each area of the complex would have had its own characteristic scent, providing another form of navigation for those familiar with the structure. The temperature would vary throughout the complex in ways that seem almost magical. The massive stone construction would have created natural climate control, keeping the interior spaces cool during the heat of the day and releasing stored warmth during the cooler nighttime hours. The underground chambers would maintain constant temperatures year-round, creating environments that felt otherworldly to visitors accustomed to the dramatic temperature variations of the desert. Air circulation through the structure would have been carefully planned to ensure that all areas remained habitable despite the complex's enormous size. The architects incorporated natural ventilation systems that drew fresh air from the courtyards and light wells, circulated it through the interior spaces, and expelled stale air through carefully placed openings. The movement of air through the complex would create subtle sounds, whispers and sighs that would seem to come from the building itself. The play of light throughout the labyrinth would create a constantly changing visual environment. As the sun moved across the sky, different chambers would be illuminated in sequence, creating a kind of temporal architecture where the same space could feel completely different depending on the time of day. Oil lamps and torches would add their flickering light to the natural illumination, creating dancing shadows that made the walls seem to move and breathe. The tactile experience of moving through the labyrinth would be equally rich. Different types of stone would feel different underfoot and hand, some smooth and cool, others rough and warm. Bronze fixtures would provide smooth, metallic surfaces that contrasted with the organic texture of stone. Water features would add the sensation of moisture to the air and the feeling of cool liquid to anyone who chose to touch the fountains and pools. Most importantly, there would be the psychological experience of being in a space so vast and complex that it challenged the very limits of human spatial perception. The confusion and disorientation that Herodotus described would be accompanied by a sense of awe at being inside something that was clearly beyond normal human scale and comprehension. The labyrinth would feel alive, responsive, and intelligent in ways that modern buildings rarely achieve. As we near the end of our journey through the mystery of the Lost Labyrinth, we must confront the haunting reality that this wonder of the ancient world has vanished almost completely from the physical landscape. Yet, in another sense, the labyrinth has achieved a kind of immortality that its builders might never have imagined. The structure that Amenemhat III created to serve as his eternal resting place has indeed become eternal, but not in the way he intended. Instead of preserving his physical body and earthly treasures for the afterlife, the labyrinth has preserved something far more precious, the memory of human achievement, the proof that our species is capable of creating beauty and complexity that can inspire wonder across millennia. Every time someone reads Herodotus' description of the labyrinth, the structure is rebuilt in imagination. Every time an artist creates a work inspired by the lost complex, every time an architect designs a building that incorporates some of its principles, every time a writer uses the labyrinth as a metaphor for life's complexity, the ancient structure lives again. This imaginary afterlife is perhaps more fitting than the physical preservation that the pharaohs sought for their monuments. Physical structures, no matter how well built, are vulnerable to earthquakes, floods, human destruction, and the simple erosion of time. But ideas, stories, and dreams of human achievement can survive indefinitely, passed from generation to generation through the mysterious alchemy of human culture and memory. The Lost Labyrinth has become a symbol of several profound truths about human civilization. It represents our species' endless drive to create, to build something larger and more complex than what came before. It demonstrates our ability to work together on projects that require the coordination of thousands of people over many decades. It shows our capacity to embed deep meaning and symbolism into physical structures, creating buildings that function on multiple levels simultaneously. But the labyrinth also represents the fragility of human achievement. It reminds us that even our most magnificent accomplishments can be forgotten, that knowledge accumulated over centuries can be lost in a few generations, and that civilizations that seem permanent and unshakable can vanish, leaving barely a trace behind. This dual nature, the power of human creativity and the vulnerability of human achievement, makes the Lost Labyrinth a perfect metaphor for our own times. We live in an age when we're creating wonders that would have seemed impossible to previous generations, yet we're also acutely aware of how quickly our own civilization could be disrupted or destroyed by climate change, war, or other catastrophic events. The priests who once navigated the corridors of the labyrinth with perfect confidence could never have imagined that their sacred knowledge would be completely forgotten, that their carefully maintained traditions would be broken, that their magnificent structure would be reduced to scattered stones buried beneath farmers' fields. Yet this is exactly what happened, and it serves as a sobering reminder of how quickly human knowledge and achievement can be lost. At the same time, the continuing fascination with the Lost Labyrinth demonstrates the resilience of human imagination and curiosity. 25 centuries after Herodotus visited the complex, people around the world are still captivated by his description, still searching for the physical remains, still drawing inspiration from the idea of a structure so complex and meaningful that it challenged the very limits of human comprehension. As we settle deeper into our rest, let's take one final journey through the Lost Labyrinth, not the physical structure that once stood in the Egyptian desert, but the eternal version that exists in the realm of human imagination and memory. In this imaginary labyrinth, the chambers number not 3,000, but infinity. Each room contains not just the physical spaces that Amenemhat III's architects created, but all the rooms that have been inspired by their work over the centuries. Here you'll find the garden mazes of Renaissance palaces, the psychological labyrinths of modern literature, the virtual mazes of computer games, and the meditative labyrinths that contemporary artists have created for spiritual contemplation. The corridors of this infinite labyrinth connect not just different rooms, but different times and cultures. A passage that begins in ancient Egypt might lead to a chamber filled with medieval manuscripts describing miraculous buildings, then continue to a Renaissance artist's studio where plans for impossible architectures are being drawn, then open into a modern laboratory where archaeologists are using ground-penetrating radar to search for buried ancient structures. In the underground chambers of this eternal labyrinth, we find not just the mummies of sacred crocodiles and the treasures of forgotten pharaohs, but all the knowledge that has been lost over the centuries. Here are the complete works of ancient authors whose texts have survived only in fragments, the architectural plans that would allow us to rebuild the great structures of antiquity, the scientific discoveries that were made and then forgotten when civilizations fell. The priests who serve in this timeless complex are not bound by the limitations of mortality. They include Herodotus himself, still wandering the corridors with his notebook, still marveling at the complexity of what human beings can create when they put their minds to it. They include the anonymous architects who designed the original structure, still walking through their creation and explaining the principles that guided their work. They include all the scholars, artists, and dreamers who have been inspired by the Lost Labyrinth over the centuries. The acoustic properties of this eternal version are even more remarkable than those of the original. Sounds echo not just through space but through time. You can hear the chanting of ancient Egyptian priests conducting rituals that haven't been performed for 2 millennia. You can listen to medieval scholars debating whether Herodotus was describing something real or mythical. You can catch fragments of conversations between modern archaeologists discussing their latest discoveries. The water that flows through this infinite structure carries more than just the physical substance that refreshed ancient visitors. It carries memories, stories, dreams, and inspirations. The fountains sing with voices of everyone who has ever been moved by the idea of the Lost Labyrinth, and the pools reflect not just the faces of those who look into them, but the faces of all the people across history who have sought to understand the mystery. In the courtyards of this eternal labyrinth, the light that illuminates the space comes not just from the sun, but from the accumulated wonder of all the people who have contemplated this ancient mystery. It's a light that never fades, that grows brighter with each person who discovers Herodotus' account and feels their imagination ignited by the possibility of such magnificence. The chambers dedicated to the 42 nomes of ancient Egypt have expanded to include rooms representing every culture and civilization that has ever existed. There are chambers for the lost cities of the Maya, the buried palaces of the Indus Valley civilization, the forgotten temples of ancient Cambodia, and countless other achievements of human creativity that time has claimed or will claim. But perhaps most importantly, this eternal labyrinth contains a chamber for every person who has ever dreamed of creating something magnificent, something that would outlast their own brief existence and inspire future generations. These chambers are filled not with gold and precious stones, but with the imperishable treasures of human aspiration, creativity, and wonder. As you rest in the comfort of your own space, wherever you are in the world, you are, in a sense, connected to this infinite labyrinth. Your curiosity about the ancient mystery, your willingness to let your imagination wander through those lost corridors, makes you one of the modern pilgrims who keep the memory of Amenemhat III's great creation alive. The physical labyrinth may have crumbled into dust and been scattered by the winds of time, but the essential spirit of what it represented, humanity's endless drive to create meaning, beauty, and wonder, remains as strong today as it was 4,000 years ago when the first stone blocks were laid in the Egyptian desert. And so the labyrinth continues to exist, not in any one place that archaeologists might excavate, but in the collective imagination of our species, in the stories we tell about human achievement and loss, in our ongoing efforts to create structures and spaces that embody our highest aspirations and deepest understanding of what it means to be human. The search for the lost labyrinth continues, not just in the fields of the Fayum where researchers probe beneath the soil with their instruments, but in the minds of everyone who refuses to accept that the greatest achievements of human civilization should simply be forgotten. Every time someone discovers Herodotus' account, every time an artist creates something inspired by the ancient wonder, every time an architect attempts to design spaces that capture some of the mystery and magnificence of the original, the labyrinth is found anew. In this way, Amenemhat III's vision of eternity has been fulfilled in a manner he could never have anticipated. His labyrinth has indeed become everlasting, not as a physical monument to his power and glory, but as an eternal inspiration to the human spirit, a reminder that we are capable of creating wonders that transcend the limitations of time, space, and mortality. In the deepest chambers of this eternal labyrinth, there exists a room that few have ever found, even in imagination. This is the chamber of first wonder, where the very moment of the labyrinth's conception is preserved forever. Here, we can witness Amenemhat III as a young prince, standing on the shores of Lake Moeris at sunset, watching the sacred crocodiles emerge from the water to bask on the muddy banks. In this moment, something stirred within the future pharaoh's mind, a vision of permanence that went beyond the temporary nature of human life. He saw, perhaps in a dream or in the play of light on water, the possibility of creating something so complex and meaningful that it would outlast not just his own mortality, but the mortality of his entire civilization. The Chamber of First Wonder contains all the sketches that were never drawn, all the models that were never built, all the conversations between the pharaoh and his architects that were never recorded but shaped the final design. Here we can see the moment when someone first suggested that the structure should have as many chambers as there are days in multiple years, when someone else proposed that it should serve not just as a tomb but as a living representation of all Egypt. From this chamber, corridors lead to the workshop of impossible dreams, where the craftsmen who built the labyrinth continue their work on projects that exist only in the realm of pure possibility. These are the master stonemasons who could cut blocks so precisely that no mortar was needed, the engineers who understood how to make water flow uphill through channels carved in solid rock, the artists who could paint in pigments that would remain bright for millennia. In their workshop, these eternal craftsmen are always working on the next chamber, the one that would have perfected their art if only they had been given more time. They shape stones that are lighter than air but stronger than diamond. They mix colors that capture not just the appearance of objects but their essence. They design mechanisms that respond not to physical touch but to the intentions and emotions of those who encounter them. The architects of the Eternal Labyrinth have their own space, the drawing room of infinite dimensions, where the plans for the structure exist in forms that transcend normal geometry. Here, the blueprints are not drawn on papyrus but written in the mathematics of space itself, where measurements include not just length, width, and height, but duration, meaning, and emotional resonance. These ghostly architects continue to refine their design, adding chambers that exist in theoretical dimensions, creating passages that connect not just different rooms but different states of consciousness, designing acoustic systems that can transmit not just sound but memories and dreams across vast distances of time and space. In the modern wing of the Eternal Labyrinth, there exists a research center where all the archaeologists who have ever searched for the lost structure continue their investigations. Here, Flinders Petrie examines artifacts that crumble to dust in the physical world but remain perfect in the realm of memory. Contemporary researchers analyze ground-penetrating radar images that reveal not just what lies beneath the soil, but what lies beneath the layers of time itself. This archaeological section of the Eternal Labyrinth contains every excavation that was never funded, every dig that was stopped by political upheaval, every discovery that was lost before it could be properly documented. The Belgian team that claimed to have found the labyrinth in 2008 continues their work here, uncovering chambers that exist in probability rather than actuality, mapping corridors that connect the possible with the actual. In the conservation laboratory of Lost Things, specialists work with technologies that exist only in imagination to preserve and restore artifacts that vanished centuries ago. They use light itself as a tool, carefully removing the patina of time from objects that exist only as shadows in historical accounts. They reconstruct broken pottery using fragments of memory, reassemble scattered stone blocks using the mortar of hope and wonder. The library attached to this research center contains every book about the labyrinth that was never written, every scholarly article that was never published, every photograph that was never taken. Here you can read Herodotus's complete account, including the sections that were lost when manuscripts were damaged or destroyed over the centuries. You can examine detailed architectural drawings made by the original builders, study the religious texts that explain the symbolism behind each chamber, and browse through maintenance records that document how the structure was kept in perfect condition for over a millennium. The translation department works constantly to decode texts written in languages that died out before they could be fully understood. These scholar spirits have unlimited time to work out the meanings of damaged inscriptions, to understand the symbolic systems that govern the labyrinth's design, and to bridge the gaps between ancient Egyptian thought and modern understanding. Their work reveals that the labyrinth was even more sophisticated than Herodotus realized. The structure incorporated mathematical principles that wouldn't be rediscovered by Western science for thousands of years, astronomical observations that required instruments more precise than anything known to exist in the ancient world, and architectural techniques that solved engineering problems in ways that modern builders are only beginning to understand. In the Department of Theoretical Reconstruction, teams of specialists use pure mathematics to rebuild the labyrinth in conceptual space. They work with equations that describe not just the physical dimensions of the structure, but its acoustic properties, its psychological effects on visitors, and its integration with the natural rhythms of the Nile River and the movements of celestial bodies. These mathematical reconstructions reveal patterns within patterns, symmetries that exist on multiple scales simultaneously, and design principles that connect the labyrinth to other great structures of antiquity. The specialists discover that the builders of the labyrinth were working with a unified theory of architecture that treated buildings not as static objects but as dynamic systems that interacted with their environment in complex ways. Throughout the eternal labyrinth, there is always movement, not the chaotic bustle of a busy building, but the measured, purposeful movement of an endless procession that has been making its way through the corridors for thousands of years. This procession includes everyone who has ever been touched by the mystery of the lost structure, from Herodotus himself to modern archaeologists, from medieval scholars to contemporary artists. At the head of the procession walks Amenemhat III, no longer the powerful pharaoh who commanded the construction of the great complex, but a humble seeker who has spent eternity trying to understand what his own vision created. Behind him come his architects and engineers, still debating the finer points of the design, still discovering new aspects of their own creation that they hadn't fully appreciated during their lifetimes. The priests of the original labyrinth maintain their positions in the procession, carrying the keys to chambers that exist now only in memory, chanting prayers in languages that died out centuries ago but echo still in the acoustic chambers of the eternal structure. They carry with them the sacred animals that were once mummified and buried in the underground chambers, not as preserved corpses, but as living spirits that embody the principles of transformation and renewal that were central to Egyptian religious thought. Herodotus walks among them, his writing materials in hand, still taking notes about what he observes, still struggling to find words adequate to describe the wonders that surround him. His companions are the other great travelers and historians of antiquity, Strabo, who visited Egypt during the Roman period, Diodorus Siculus, who tried to reconcile different accounts of Egyptian marvels, and countless others who were drawn to Egypt by tales of its impossible achievements. Medieval scholars join the procession, carrying manuscripts that preserve fragments of ancient knowledge, debating whether the descriptions they've inherited from classical authors represent reality or myth. Their discussions echo through the corridors, adding layers of interpretation and analysis to the direct observations of earlier visitors. Renaissance artists and architects add their own voice to the eternal conversation, bringing with them sketches of labyrinthine gardens and impossible buildings inspired by descriptions of the lost Egyptian complex. They walk alongside Enlightenment scholars who applied rational analysis to ancient mysteries, trying to separate fact from fiction in the accumulated accounts of the wonder. Modern archaeologists bring their scientific instruments and methodological rigor to the procession, but they also bring a deep appreciation for the human drive to create meaning through architecture. Their conversations with ancient builders reveal how little the fundamental human motivations have changed. We still want to build something that will outlast our own brief existence, still want to embed our deepest understanding of the universe into the structures we create. Contemporary artists contribute their own interpretations to the ongoing dialogue, creating works that translate ancient mysteries into modern artistic languages. Their installations and sculptures become new chambers in the eternal labyrinth, spaces where visitors can experience something of the awe and wonder that the original structure inspired. The procession moves constantly but never reaches a destination, because the eternal labyrinth has no beginning and no end. It is a space that exists outside normal time, where all moments coexist simultaneously. Past, present, and future visitors to the mystery walk together, sharing their observations and interpretations, adding to the accumulated understanding of what human beings can achieve when they commit themselves to creating something larger than their individual lives. In the eternal labyrinth, the stones themselves are alive with memory and meaning. Each block remembers the hands that shaped it, the tools that carved it, the ceremonies that blessed it before it was set in place. The limestone recalls the ancient sea where it was formed millions of years ago, when the region that would become Egypt lay beneath warm, shallow waters teeming with marine life. The granite blocks remember their origins in the quarries of Aswan, where skilled workers split them from the living rock using techniques passed down through generations. They remember the journey down the Nile River on barges guided by experienced pilots who knew every sandbar and current, the careful loading and unloading at docks specially built to handle their massive weight. Each stone bears within it the record of its transformation from raw material to finished architectural element. The surface decorations carved into many blocks contain not just visible hieroglyphs and images, but invisible layers of meaning that can be read by those who know how to look. These decorations tell stories within stories, myths within myths, creating a textual labyrinth that parallels the physical maze of chambers and corridors. The mortar that binds the stones together in the eternal version of the labyrinth is not made from lime and sand, but from the accumulated faith and dedication of the thousands of people who participated in the construction project. This spiritual mortar has proven more durable than any physical adhesive, holding the structure together across millennia even as the original building crumbled into ruins. The bronze fixtures that once adorned the labyrinth, door handles, decorative elements, lampstands, and ceremonial objects continue to gleam in the eternal version as brightly as the day they were cast. These metal objects remember the heat of the forges where they were created, the skill of the craftsmen who shaped them, and the sacred fires of the ceremonies where they were consecrated for their roles in the great complex. The wooden elements of the structure, long since rotted away in the physical world, remain perfect in the eternal labyrinth. Cedar beams from Lebanon remember the forests where they grew, the axes that felled them, the ships that carried them across the Mediterranean to Egypt. Their grain patterns tell stories of seasons and weather, of droughts and abundant years, creating a chronological record that extends far beyond the period of the labyrinth's construction. The floors of the eternal labyrinth bear the imprints of everyone who has ever walked through the structure, from ancient Egyptian priests conducting daily rituals to modern tourists who might have visited if the building still existed. These footprints create pathways of light that show the most commonly traveled routes through the complex, revealing patterns of movement that reflect both the practical necessities of using the building and the spiritual significance of different areas within it. The walls themselves have become repositories of memory, absorbing not just the sounds that echoed through the chambers during the centuries when the labyrinth was active, but also the thoughts and emotions of everyone who experienced the structure. Visitors to the eternal version can sometimes hear these accumulated memories, whispered prayers from ancient ceremonies, excited discussions between scholars discovering new aspects of the design, quiet contemplation from individuals who came to the labyrinth seeking spiritual guidance. The acoustic properties that so impressed Herodotus have evolved in the eternal labyrinth to encompass not just the transmission of sound, but the communication of meaning across barriers of language and time. Visitors who speak different languages find that their words are automatically translated for others in their vicinity, while concepts that have no direct linguistic equivalent are communicated through direct transfer of understanding. The lighting system of the Eternal Labyrinth draws energy not just from the sun and oil lamps, but from the accumulated wonder and curiosity of everyone who has ever contemplated the mystery of the lost structure. This wonderlight illuminates not just the physical features of the chambers, but the significance and meaning embedded in every architectural detail. The underground chambers, forbidden to Herodotus but accessible in the Eternal version, reveal their secrets gradually to visitors who approach them with the proper combination of respect, curiosity, and humility. These spaces contain not just the mummified remains of sacred animals and the treasures of ancient pharaohs, but the crystallized dreams and aspirations of everyone who has ever been inspired by the labyrinth story. What makes the Eternal Labyrinth truly infinite is not just its size, but its capacity for endless discovery. No matter how many times a visitor explores its corridors, there are always new chambers to find, new details to notice, new connections to make between different aspects of the structure. This inexhaustible quality mirrors the nature of human knowledge itself. The more we learn about any subject, the more we realize how much more there is to discover. Each visitor to the Eternal Labyrinth brings their own background, interests, and perspectives, and the structure responds by revealing aspects of itself that are particularly relevant to their individual journey of discovery. Mathematicians find chambers filled with geometric principles and numerical relationships that demonstrate ancient Egyptian understanding of advanced mathematical concepts. Musicians discover acoustic spaces that reveal how sound was used as a tool for spiritual transformation and practical communication. Historians uncover rooms that contain perfect records of daily life in the ancient complex, administrative documents, personal letters, maintenance logs, and ceremonial schedules that provide intimate insights into how the labyrinth actually functioned as a living, working institution. Psychologists find spaces that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how architectural environments affect human consciousness and behavior. Artists discover workshops where ancient craftsmen developed techniques and created works that were centuries ahead of their time, using materials and methods that seem almost magical by the standards of their era. These workshop spaces contain tools and materials that allow modern artists to experiment with ancient techniques, creating new works that bridge the gap between contemporary artistic expression and traditional Egyptian aesthetics. Engineers find chambers where the original builders solved technical problems in ways that modern engineering is only beginning to appreciate. These spaces contain working models of the ventilation systems that kept air circulating throughout the enormous complex, demonstrations of the hydraulic engineering that managed water distribution, and examples of the structural engineering that allowed the construction of chambers spanning greater distances than should have been possible with the materials available at the time. Philosophers discover meditation chambers where the relationship between human consciousness and architectural space was explored in ways that anticipated modern phenomenology and environmental psychology by thousands of years. These spaces demonstrate how the builders understood that human perception and spatial experience are intimately connected, and how architectural design can be used to induce specific states of consciousness and spiritual awareness. Religious scholars find sanctuaries dedicated to deities whose worship has been forgotten for millennia, but whose spiritual principles remain relevant to contemporary seekers. These sacred spaces contain rituals and practices that demonstrate the sophisticated psychological and spiritual insights of ancient Egyptian religious tradition, showing how ceremonial activities were designed to produce genuine transformation in participants. Archaeologists working in the Eternal Labyrinth have access to perfect preservation and unlimited time, allowing them to conduct the kind of detailed, careful excavation that is rarely possible in the physical world. They can examine every artifact in its original context, trace the development of architectural techniques across the construction period, and understand how different phases of building were integrated into the overall design. The research library attached to the Eternal Labyrinth contains not just the books and documents that were lost over the centuries, but also the works that would have been written if scholars had had access to complete information about the structure. These theoretical texts explore what ancient Egyptian architecture might have developed into if the civilization had continued to flourish, how the principles embodied in the labyrinth might have been applied to other building projects, and what modern architecture could learn from the advanced techniques demonstrated in the ancient complex. Conservation specialists in the Eternal Labyrinth work with materials and techniques that exist only in the realm of pure possibility, allowing them to preserve not just objects but the knowledge and skills that created them. They maintain a workshop where the traditional techniques of ancient Egyptian craftsmen are kept alive, where modern practitioners can learn methods that were once considered trade secrets, and where new applications of old principles are constantly being developed. The Eternal Labyrinth also serves as a meeting place for specialists from different fields who might never have had the opportunity to collaborate in the physical world. Mathematicians work alongside musicians to understand the mathematical principles underlying the structure's acoustic design. Historians collaborate with engineers to recreate the construction techniques used by ancient builders. Artists work with archaeologists to develop new methods for visualizing and interpreting ancient spaces. These interdisciplinary collaborations regularly produce insights that wouldn't have been possible within the boundaries of any single field of study. The Eternal Labyrinth becomes not just a place for preserving ancient knowledge, but a laboratory for developing new understanding that bridges the gap between past and present, between ancient wisdom and modern scientific methodology. Perhaps most remarkably, the Eternal Labyrinth continues to grow and evolve, adding new chambers and passages as human understanding of the original structure deepens and expands. Each new archaeological discovery in the physical world creates corresponding spaces in the eternal version. Each new artistic work inspired by the labyrinth adds its own chamber to the infinite complex. Each new visitor brings their own perspective and contributes to the ongoing evolution of this space that exists at the intersection of history, imagination, and human aspiration. The Eternal Labyrinth becomes, in this way, a collaborative work of art and scholarship that spans centuries and involves thousands of contributors, both living and dead, all united by their fascination with humanity's capacity to create structures that embody our deepest understanding of beauty, meaning, and the mysterious relationship between consciousness and space. In its infinite corridors, the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt achieves the immortality that its builders dreamed of, not as a static monument to ancient power, but as a living symbol of the eternal human quest to understand our place in the cosmos and to create lasting beauty that will inspire future generations to continue that quest. The water that flows through the eternal structure carries with it not just the physical properties of the original fountains and channels, but the fluid nature of human memory itself. Each drop contains stories that have been passed down through generations, accounts that have been embellished and refined, details that have been forgotten and then remembered again in new forms. The sound of this eternal water creates a constant background music that connects all the chambers, a gentle rhythm that mirrors the pulse of human curiosity and the flow of knowledge from one generation to the next. In the conservatory gardens that exist within some of the larger courtyards of the Eternal Labyrinth, plants grow that have been extinct in the physical world for millennia. These are the sacred flowers that once adorned the altars of Egyptian temples, the medicinal herbs that ancient physicians used to heal both body and spirit, the trees that provided shade for pilgrims who traveled vast distances to experience the wonder of the great complex. These eternal gardens are tended by spirits who remember the agricultural techniques of ancient Egypt, who understand how to coax life from desert soil, and who know the secret names that must be spoken to make plants thrive in impossible conditions. The fragrance of these eternal gardens drifts through the corridors, mixing with the incense that burns perpetually in the religious chambers and the clean scent of stone that has been polished smooth by countless hands over countless years. This complex olfactory landscape creates another layer of navigation through the structure, where visitors can follow their noses to find specific areas or simply allow themselves to be guided by the subtle changes in fragrance that indicate transitions from one type of space to another. The Eternal Labyrinth exists not just as a single structure, but as a template that has influenced countless other architectural projects throughout history. In its theoretical wings, visitors can explore the buildings that were inspired by the original complex, the labyrinthine libraries of medieval monasteries, the palace gardens of Renaissance Italy, the impossible architectures imagined by modern artists and writers. Each of these derivative structures maintains a connection to the original through principles of design, construction, and purpose that transcend specific cultural contexts. The administrative chambers of the Eternal Labyrinth continue to function as they did in ancient times, but now they manage not just the affairs of a single kingdom, but the accumulated knowledge and cultural heritage of all human civilization. Here, scribes work with writing materials that never run dry, recording discoveries that are made in archaeological sites around the world, translating texts that bridge gaps between different cultures and historical periods, and maintaining archives that preserve every story, every account, and every interpretation that has ever been offered about the lost wonder. These eternal administrators understand that their work is never finished, that there will always be new discoveries to record, new interpretations to consider, and new connections to make between disparate pieces of information. They work with the patience of immortals, knowing that truth emerges slowly through the accumulation of many partial understandings, and that their role is to maintain the systems that allow this gradual emergence of knowledge to continue across generations. The teaching chambers of the Eternal Labyrinth serve as classrooms where master craftsmen who worked on the original structure share their knowledge with modern practitioners who seek to understand ancient techniques. These instructional spaces operate outside normal time, allowing students to spend as long as necessary to master complex skills, to make mistakes without permanent consequences, and to experiment with variations and innovations that build upon traditional methods. In these educational spaces, the barriers between teacher and student dissolve as experience is shared directly through demonstration and practice. An ancient stone carver can show a modern sculptor exactly how to achieve particular effects with specific types of stone, while a contemporary engineer can help an ancient architect understand how modern materials might have been used to solve problems that challenged the original builders. The Eternal Labyrinth also contains spaces dedicated to the preservation of languages, both those that have died out completely and those that exist only in fragmentary form. In these linguistic chambers, the conversations that once took place during the construction and operation of the original complex continue, preserved in their original languages but somehow comprehensible to visitors regardless of their native tongues. These preserved conversations reveal not just factual information about the labyrinth, but the attitudes, emotions, and cultural contexts that shaped its creation. The mathematical principles that govern the labyrinth's design continue to be explored in specialized chambers where numbers exist as living entities rather than abstract concepts. Here, visitors can experience directly the geometric relationships that determine the placement of chambers, the proportional systems that created harmony between different areas of the complex, and the astronomical calculations that align the structure with celestial phenomena. These mathematical spaces demonstrate how ancient Egyptian builders understood numbers not just as tools for measurement, but as fundamental aspects of the cosmic order that governed all existence. The Eternal Labyrinth serves as a repository for all the dreams that were never realized, all the expansion projects that were planned but never built, all the refinements and improvements that the original builders envisioned for future generations to implement. These theoretical additions exist as fully developed architectural spaces that demonstrate how the labyrinth might have evolved if it had continued to be actively developed and expanded over the centuries. In the meditation chambers of the Eternal Labyrinth, the spiritual practices that once took place within the original structure continue without interruption. Here, priests who have been dead for millennia maintain the rituals that were designed to keep the cosmic forces in balance, to ensure the continued prosperity of Egypt, and to provide spiritual guidance for seekers who approach with sincere intentions. These eternal ceremonies create fields of spiritual energy that permeate the entire structure, making it not just a place for intellectual study, but a space for genuine spiritual transformation. The Eternal Labyrinth demonstrates that some human achievements transcend the physical materials from which they were constructed, that the true significance of our greatest architectural accomplishments lies not in their durability as objects, but in their power to inspire continued creativity, exploration, and wonder. The Lost Labyrinth of Egypt lives on not because its stones have survived, but because the vision that created it continues to challenge and inspire anyone who encounters its story. As our exploration of this eternal wonder draws to a close, we find ourselves not at an ending, but at a beginning, the beginning of our own participation in the ongoing story of human achievement and aspiration. The labyrinth that Amenemhat III built in the Egyptian desert may have crumbled to dust, but the principles it embodied, the dreams it represented, and the wonder it inspired remain as vital today as they were 4,000 years ago. Every time we attempt to create something beautiful, something meaningful, something that will outlast our own brief existence, we become part of the eternal construction project that the labyrinth represents. Every time we refuse to accept that knowledge should be lost or that beauty should be forgotten, we add our own chamber to the infinite structure that exists in the realm of human memory and imagination. The search for the Lost Labyrinth continues in archaeological sites across Egypt, in the laboratories where researchers analyze ancient materials, in the studios where artists create works inspired by ancient mysteries, and in the minds of everyone who believes that human beings are capable of achievements that transcend the ordinary limitations of time and space. In the end, the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt teaches us that the most important human creations are not the physical structures we build, but the inspiration we provide for future generations to continue the endless work of creating beauty, seeking truth, and building bridges between the world as it is and the world as it could be. The labyrinth lives on in every act of human creativity, in every search for knowledge, and in every moment when wonder overcomes cynicism and possibility triumphs over despair. The corridors of the Eternal Labyrinth remain open to all who seek them, waiting for the next curious soul to discover their wonders, to add their own story to the accumulated narrative of human achievement, and to pass on to future generations the eternal message that we are capable of creating miracles when we commit ourselves to visions larger than our individual lives. And so we reach the end of our journey through the Lost Labyrinth of Egypt, that magnificent structure that existed once in stone and mortar in the deserts of ancient Egypt, and exists still in the infinite corridors of human imagination and memory. The mystery remains, the wonder continues, and the search goes on, as it always has and always will, as long as human beings retain the capacity to dream of greatness and the courage to pursue those dreams into reality. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this journey through one of history's most fascinating mysteries. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers, and may your rest be filled with visions of the magnificent possibilities that await those who dare to dream of creating wonders that will inspire future generations long after we ourselves have become part of the eternal story.